This past spring, like a lot of other vineyards around the area, we had a late freeze that caused a lot of fruit loss, we'll say.
Welcome to Well Said, Finger Lakes, the podcast where we speak with businesses, organizations, and interesting people from in and around the Finger Lakes region. We're here in the live room at Well Said Media in Ithaca, New York, and you can't talk about Finger Lakes without talking about Finger Lakes wine. So our guest today is Nancy Tisch from Bet the Farm Winery in Trumansburg. How's it going, Nancy?
It's going great today.
That's awesome. Let's start out the podcast with just you instead of Bet the Farm, and we'll get there. But I want to know, how long have you lived in the Finger Lakes region?
Let's see. I moved here to the Finger Lakes in 1998. I came here originally to accept a postdoc position at Cornell University. After working there for a few years and not landing a tenure track position anywhere, I left academia and went on to start my own business.
What was your business then?
The winery.
Oh, that was the move right there.
Yeah, that was in 2006, so I gave academia a good shot. I spent some time, but at that point in my life, I was a little bit older and not really interested in the adjunct professor role where every semester I was looking for a new job. So I just took a left turn and moved into hospitality first at the Aurora Inn, and then had the opportunity to start a business and just went for it.
That's really cool. So did your time at Cornell sort of expose you to the Finger Lakes wine, or did you know about it before you came here?
I didn't really know very much about wine at all when I started the business, actually. I had gone into hospitality, so I was working at the Aurora Inn. I knew a little bit about tourism to the Finger Lakes region at that point because that was part of my job. And so we would refer people to different wineries around the area. So once I got into that role at the inn as a sort of like a concierge or innkeeper at one of their properties, I started to learn more about Finger Lakes wines, but I really didn't know very much about wine at the time.
What was your first step in learning about it?
Starting a business.
Oh, so you dove right in.
Is that an acceptable? Well, I did kind of dive right in, and I was really fortunate. I had just met Kit Kelfs at the time. I met him, and I was working at the Aurora Inn. He was working at Sheldrake Point Winery. That's one of those connections in the tourism business. And, I was asking him questions about, where should I send my guests to go taste wine, and, that kind of stuff. So after I think it was in the fall of 2005, I made a decision to leave the Aurora Inn after opening up their E.B. Morgan house. I was contemplating buying a bed and breakfast at the time, and that's why I sought that experience. But after doing that, I thought that I really didn't want to be that immersed in my own business. So I waited for another opportunity to come along. About 6 to 8 months later, the inn had a small property, and the general manager asked me to think of an idea to go into that property. It was a small retail space right next to the inn, and I thought it would be great with food and wine. And to do that in New York, you had to learn to make wine. Well, you had to make wine. You have to be a winery to sell food and wine in the same space. We don't sell wine in grocery stores here, and we don't sell food at the liquor store. You can't even buy a mixer in the liquor store. So they're very separated by New York state law. So I said, okay, I'll learn to make wine. And Kit introduced me to Lou Damiani and Phil Davis, and they agreed to let me make my wine at their facility over in Hector, New York. And that's how it all started.
That's incredible. And Damiani is such a great winery too. What was it like learning from those folks?
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. I mean, it was challenging for me because I really didn't know anything, but Lou taught me a lot about how to make wine, what the basic steps are, what kinds of equipment to buy in terms of tanks and barrels and all of that kind of stuff. The hard part about it was that they used the winery during the day, so I used the winery during their off hours, which meant often that Kit and I would travel over to the winery at 8 o'clock at night maybe and finish up around midnight, and then we were done for the day. So it meant for some long days, but we're so grateful that they gave us that opportunity.
Yeah, that sounds like a hustle.
Yeah, it was. I was younger then, so it was okay.
When you think back on that time, did you have any favorite wines then? And is it still your favorite wine today? Like, I'm talking about a varietal, not just a Damiani wine or a Bet the Farm wine.
I started out, I made a blend. My first wine was a blend of Cayuga and Vidal Blanc. And I don't make that wine anymore. I do still work with the Cayuga grape, but I don't make that blend anymore. And I would say that at the time, I didn't really have a favorite wine. I probably, just before starting this, I probably drank more Italian wine than Finger Lakes wines. So I didn't really have a favorite. But when I went and tasted wines with Phil and Lou before I approached them about making wine at their facility, I was really impressed with what they were doing with red wines. And back in 2006, well, this would have been 2005 probably that I tasted with them, or early 2006. And back at that time, I don't think there were a lot of really good red wine producers in the Finger Lakes. I think Lou and Phil were one of the leaders in that. So I felt like that was a good choice for me to go and learn to make wine with somebody that I thought was doing a really good job.
And so was the red wine was there a varietal in the red wine area that you really enjoyed during that time?
Yeah, I enjoy, well, in the Italians wines, I like any Chianti or
nice.
Montepulciano or some of those medium-bodied reds that are really great with food. So that's really what my background was in wine at the time. There were times when I drank bigger reds before that. I had a California phase where I couldn't get big zins often enough. But by that time, I had gone to something a little more subtle and a little more food-friendly. In 2007, I made my first vintage of Cabernet Franc, which I was pretty excited about, too, as a grape to work with. I think it's classic Finger Lakes red. It makes great wine, medium body, really nice fruit flavors, and great to pair with food.
Yeah, and it seems like, at least with my experience around the area, that the white wines really shine here. Wines like Riesling seems to be a really popular one around here.
Riesling is very popular. There is a funny thing about myself and Riesling, me and Riesling. I don't know which is the correct grammar, but I didn't make Riesling until 2017. Was my first vintage of Riesling. And part of the reason for that was I don't love it that much. It's not exactly my favorite wine. And I was working with a business model where I sold other Finger Lakes wines. So I had great Riesling producers around me that I could buy their wine and sell it in my shop in Aurora. So I didn't really have a need to fill that spot on my shelves. I could let the other wineries and the other producers do that for me. And there's some great Riesling producers here, so I didn't feel like I needed to throw my hat into that ring. You know, there's plenty of great Riesling around.
Yes, it is very saturated around here, and there it ranges from excellent to okay, and it definitely you get the dry to the sweet scale too. It seems like everybody does a bunch of different things with Riesling, and I like that because it's kind of fun to see what people are doing, but definitely saturated. So I can understand why you wanted to stray away from it at the start for sure. So Bet the Farm Winery. Where's that name come from? It's very interesting.
Yeah, so you remember I told you about having met Kit and talked to Lou and Phil Davis and Lou Damiani at Damiani Wine Cellars. And at one point I got a little bit of cold feet and said to Kit, I said, I don't really know about this. I don't really know what I'm doing. And he said, don't worry, I'll help you. You can bet the farm on it. And I said, oh, that'd make a nice name. And he said, what? And I said, Bet the Farm. I said, we have all these connections to agriculture and all these connections to grape growers. Our business model at the time, it still continues today, that we carry a lot of local cheeses. So I was like, yeah, I think that'd be a great name. So we just went with it. We never thought of anything else. So when I had to write a business plan, that's what was on the top.
I love it because it means so much that you actually went all in. Like, that's what it means to me. You guys are all in on this winery thing, and it shows, too. You guys live up to the name.
Well, thank you.
I love visiting the winery whenever I get the chance. But tell us about the experience buying the winery, because you said you started out in Aurora, but then you moved now in Trumansburg. So what was that like?
So it was interesting. So just to give you a little background, our shop in Aurora was maybe 500 square feet of retail space, so quite small. And we had been in that space from 2006 to the end of 2018. In 2017, we had the opportunity to buy some land. And I found that sort of by accident, just driving around one day and saw a for sale sign on Crumbs Corners Road. And we looked into it, checked the soil types, all of this stuff. So we were able to buy that piece of property. Fortunately, at the time, we had the cash investment to make for the land. Then following that, we needed to build a building. And we were able to work with the bank to secure the mortgage for that building, that production barn and tasting room that we have on the property. That process, I think, went a little bit easier for us because we had, I don't know what the word is. There's a word that's escaping me, but we had a track record, let's say, of being able to produce and sell wine. So I think the bank was less hesitant to loan us the money to build a building than they might have been otherwise if we came in like newbies and didn't know anything.
Right. Yeah. So it was just a plot of land. It didn't already have vines on it.
Oh, no. There were no vines. It was a cornfield, actually, when we first looked at it. And we spent some effort there. We had drainage tile installed. We had a process called deep ripping, which is where they go in and use this plow to make a really deep furrow where the vines are going to be planted. It just loosens up that soil so that the roots can expand deeper into the soil without any problems. And we had that done in 2017 because we planted in the spring of 2018.
So since it wasn't already a vineyard, how did you know vines and growing grapes on the land would work?
We did a little research on the U.S. Geological Survey, the soil maps, and the soil types that are on that property are Lansing and Canisius soils, which are if I have this right, I believe are gravelly loam type soils, which are very good for growing grapes. If you've ever walked in our vineyard, and if I don't think you have, but
I've been out there.
You should.
Yeah.
We grow rocks too. We grow a lot of rocks. Every winter, there's more rocks coming up from that soil. So it's loose. It's not highly compacted soil, and it works really well for growing grapes.
Very interesting. Sounds like there's a lot to think about when buying land for a winery that isn't already a vineyard.
Yes, I would say there is. I would say one issue with the site that we have is that we do have a tendency to be a bit colder than some other sites closer to the lake. So we've faced that challenge. Last year, we had a pretty strong winter mortality. And then this past spring, like a lot of other vineyards around the area, we had a late freeze that caused a lot of fruit loss, we'll say.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah.
Is it still looking okay for like yield for harvest
The
time
yield
this
will
year?
be down. The yield will definitely be down this year.
Okay.
But the vines look good. They're growing. We have what are called secondary buds that are many of which are fruitful. So we're pretty excited about that.
I'm excited too.
Opportunity to learn too, which I'm really excited about. But
Learn from the different things that happen with the climate each year?
well, learn from the late freeze event to see how well different varieties produce in the secondaries, and see whether or not those secondaries will actually have the opportunity to ripen before the end of the season, and to see whether or not we can, if they ripen well enough, and catch up to the primaries. So it's just a great opportunity for learning more about grapes and fruit production from the vines. And it's sad that we won't have as much fruit, but I think it'll be good fruit. I think it'll be high quality.
That's a really interesting and great perspective to have. I mean, at the beginning of the year when you're talking about this loss, I could imagine that being very discouraging right when it happened. Were you discouraged when that happened, or were you thinking in this mindset then too?
I think pretty early on I was like, well, I think we're just going to have to roll with the punches because we can't control the weather. We can do what we can do to improve after that. After an event happens like that, we can take the opportunity to learn, but at the end of the day, we can't control the weather. I mean, we still don't know that we're going to get any fruit at all this year. There could be other things that happen. Some vineyards have been hit by hailstorms and completely destroyed. I talked to a grower over on Seneca Lake, and he shared a hailstorm story that occurred in August. I think it was back in 1988. They lost 2 years of fruit production from that, because the fruit that would have remained dormant in the vine, once the fruit that was supposed to ripen that year was ripped off, the buds that should have remained dormant pushed, and they didn't ripen any fruit in the few remaining weeks of the season, so they didn't get fruit the following year either.
Wow.
So
that's scary.
It is pretty scary. Thankfully, that event was relatively localized, so it wasn't as pervasive. This event that occurred in May was pretty broad across much of the region, and a lot of vineyards got hit pretty hard.
That's a bummer, but I like your perspective about it being a learning opportunity.
Thank you.
And I hope that you still have a great yield this year.
Yeah. It won't be a lot, but it'll be good.
Speaking of hailstorms and the climate, what are some of the qualities about the Finger Lakes region, climate, and terroir that makes this area so unique when compared to other regions, say like California or places in Germany or Italy?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the Finger Lakes is a cool climate growing region. one of the things that we've seen recently is a lot of variability from one vintage to the next. So it makes it a little bit challenging as a winemaker. One year you might be getting, fruit coming in at 23 bricks. The next year it might be at 19 bricks.
What's a brick?
Brick is a measure of how much sugar is in the fruit. It's basically measured by specific gravity, and it just tells you how much is in there. So 23 bricks is really ripe fruit. Little atypical, not atypical. It's an exceptional year. Like 2020 was a really good year. Was not uncommon to see fruit that ripe. But more typical levels of sugar in the Finger Lakes are like 20 to 22. And those will yield medium-bodied wines. When you start getting up 23, 24 bricks, you start approaching a more full-bodied expression of the wine. But again, that climate I'm not going to call it climate variation. I'll call it vintage variation. Year to year, the challenges are different. So 2020 was a great, warm, dry growing year. 2021 was a little rainy, cloudy, wet, very humid. So 2021 had a lot of disease pressure in the vineyard, but a great crop of fruit. I mean, our 2021 harvest probably hit some records in terms of fruit production for the area. And I know that some fruits, like the Riesling that we talked about before, they couldn't find, people that were growing Riesling couldn't find enough markets for it because there was so much of it.
We're talking about Riesling and it being a varietal that might be well suited for the Finger Lakes region, but what are the best suited varietals here, do you think? Is it Riesling, or are there better varietals, better grapes for this region?
That's a good question. I would say, so one of the topics that keeps coming up over and over again, I talked about that vintage variation. A lot of that is thought to be related to climate change. And as climate starts to change or is changing, we want to have grapes that are more disease resistant and for those humid years. So those humid years, the diseases that can impact grapes are downy mildew, powdery mildew, can also get a lot of botrytis in the fruit portion of the grape. So Cornell does a great job. They just named a new grape that they developed. It's a cross between Riesling and Cayuga. Cayuga is a grape I mentioned earlier, but that's been around, I think, since the 50s. I think it was developed in the 50s and widely planted throughout the Finger Lakes. But at Cornell, they just named this grape Aravel, which is a cross between those two cultivars, between the Riesling and the Cayuga. It's supposed to be much more disease resistant, can be cropped at a higher level. So by that I mean you can grow more tons per acre and successfully grow more tons per acre and make some nice quality wines from it.
Wow, what's it supposed to taste like? Does it taste anything like Riesling?
It does taste, I think, Riesling-like. I would bet, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't bet, but I would think that most people wouldn't know that it's not Riesling if you didn't tell them.
Okay. And Cornell does a lot of work with making hybrids, right? Is that what they call them?
Yes, they're called hybrids. And yeah, Cornell's done a lot of them. This is the newest one. Actually, that's not true. There's a couple others that haven't been named yet. They only get planted and grown as New York. I think Aravel was New York 82, and I think now there's a New York 85, but I don't know very much about it.
Fair enough, but Aravel is like the big time one coming up on the scene, like everybody's excited to work with this grape. Do you have any plans on planting Aravel vines?
I personally don't have plans on planting Aravel vines, but if I were going to plant more fruit, it would be one that I would consider. I think at 6 acres, very small vineyard by other standards, it's about as much as we can handle. So
Makes sense.
yeah.
But Aravel is looking like it might be the best suited wine or best suited grape, for the Finger Lakes region because it was genetically engineered to be so.
Yeah, I think a lot of grapes are, well, not a lot of grapes, but some of the other hybrid grapes, like Traminette, is another grape that was developed at Cornell and released for viticulture probably back in the 90s. But that grape is also relatively disease resistant and supposed to be really cold hardy, but we didn't get any last year, so I don't know how cold hardy it is.
Well, last year was pretty cold, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it did get pretty cold, so hard to say. Another grape that we just planted is Dornfelder. Dornfelder is also it's a red grape. It's a very thick-skinned grape, so also disease-resistant. Cabernet Franc is highly disease-resistant. It has nice, loose clusters, thick skin. So there are a lot of grapes that are better suited to growing here. Pinot Noir is probably another one of my favorite grapes, but I've been advised not to try to grow it because it's really challenging.
Yeah, it sounds like it is a challenge to do around here, but in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, it's like all they grow there.
Yeah.
Is that just because of the climate differences?
I would say that a large part of it is due to climate difference. I've never been to the Willamette Valley, so I don't know much about their climate, but I would assume that it's less prone to the humid conditions that we can have here that cause bunch rot.
All right, that makes sense. That makes sense. Earlier you were mentioning that from year to year, yield changes, the sweetness level, the brick level of the harvest changes. How do you view flavor consistency in your wine from year to year?
That's a good question, I guess. Our goal is to make the wine that the vintage produced. So, again, from my mentor, Lou Damiani, you buy the best grapes you can get. Don't screw it up. So we don't do a lot of manipulation of the fruit. We do use commercial yeast cultures, commercial yeast strains to ferment the fruit, but we don't do a lot of sugar adjustment or acid adjustment. We really just let the vintage speak for itself. So there will be a lot of variation. Like if you tasted my 2020 Traminette and my 2021 Traminette, the flavors are the same, but the body of the wine is very different. The 2020 is a very full-bodied expression of the grape, and the 2021 is a lighter, crisper, zestier version of the same wine.
It almost seems to me like a partnership between the grape itself and the winemaker, and it being like, I don't know, kind of like a painting or a journal entry from that year. It's very interesting, like what you're saying, to do that vertical where you're doing the 2021 and the 2020 of the same varietal and have it be so much different. With those flavors coming through depending on how much sun there was or how much rain there was. It's always very interesting to me to view wine like that. Do you have any thoughts on that perspective, or do you see it that way too?
Yeah, I would agree. So, I mean, basically the grape, the particular variety of grape is going to offer certain compounds within the grape that are going to contribute to the flavor. So the flavor should be there, but the structure of the wine will change from year to year depending on that acid levels, depending on sugar levels. So in one year you might get something that's a bit more refreshing and acidic, and another year you might get something more full-bodied and lush than in a different year. So, but the flavor, I think, is always there if it's the same variety of grape.
Yeah, it's so fun to do vertical tastings like that just to see the differences from year to year. Another thing behind making wines is blends, or how long you have a wine ferment. How do you determine how long to let a wine go for before bottling? And maybe how do you determine ratios for blends, if that's a joint question that I can ask?
That's a good question. So a ratio, I'll start with the ratios for blends, because it's pretty easy for a winery at my scale. At the scale of our winery, the ratio for blends is going to depend on how much you have of each wine. And typically you're going to blend all of it unless you want to have a lot of small lots of wine. And doing a lot of small lots of wine is more expensive than doing a single lot. So for example, if I have 5 barrels of Gamay Noir and 2 barrels of Pinot Noir, and I want to make the most cost-effective blend, I would just blend them all, right? Okay. So I would compare that to some other options first. I would certainly set up blending trials and taste them, but I would say more often than not, we go for the blend that is the most cost-effective. And typically, we like it. So we wouldn't make a blend that we don't like. That's not going to happen.
How do you determine the blend and the taste of the blend before it ages? Because I imagine the flavors change a lot between the young juices and the aged wine.
Oh, yeah, it does change a lot. And, there's some funny stories about me.
We got to hear one.
When I go into the winery in November and everything, you take something like Chaminade or Pinot Gris and it's fermented dry, and I think it just tastes terrible. But you come back, in January or February, and you taste it again, and there it is. It's wine. There's a period after fermentation and before it really tastes like wine that it really doesn't, to me, it doesn't taste good at all. While the wine's fermenting, when it gets down to about 3 or 4 bricks and you have this bubbly, sweet concoction, yeasty concoction, I also like that stage in the winemaking because I think those can taste really great. But there is a point in there where I'm like, what happened to the wine? But going back, what was your other question?
It was, I'm kind of wondering now that we're on this, and we can go back in a second. So are you saying that it comes down to winemaker experience where you need to taste all of these things at different stages in order to know what it might end up tasting like afterwards?
There's a little bit of experience. And, that's another thing that Lou Damiani taught me. You just need to be patient. So sometimes you just have to wait for that wine to come back to itself. Because there is, for me anyway, there's a period of time where I think, oh my God, what have I done?
That's got to be nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it is. But I've learned over the years that it's going to come back. I just have to wait.
How long in general do you have to wait? That was the other part of the question. How long in general do you let the wine ferment in the big wooden barrels or stainless steel barrels that you have there at the Farm Winery?
Yeah, so we do the fermentation for the white wines in stainless steel, and sometimes in barrels. Some of our Chardonnay we do barrel fermentation, but typically for the barrel fermentation we don't have much temperature control, so that fermentation will proceed as quickly as it's going to proceed because we don't really have a way to chill it effectively. For the tanks, those are connected to a chiller, and we can control the temperature at which the wine ferments. For us, again, we're small-scale producers. We need that tank to be ready for the next wine. So we don't do really, there are some wineries that do really long, and I mean like hundreds of days, maybe even. But that's an extreme. But even 30, 40 days, we don't do that because we need that tank again. So we'll generally do like 12 to 14 days for a white wine. We'll keep that chilled, keep the fermentation going slow, dropping about 1/2 to 1 brick per day, and just no more than 2 bricks per day if we're doing things right. And then we'll get that moved out so that the next wine can go in. For the red wines, we ferment those in open fermentation bins, and those we generally have on the skins for about 7 to 10 days. My approach for that process is that I don't want the wines to be over-extracted, meaning I don't want so much tannin to be coming out from the skins and the seeds that make the wine a little bit too astringent for my own palate. So I look to have those usually pressed off by somewhere between 7 and 10 days.
Now, I was recently at Bet the Farm, was it last week or the week before, to help bottle last year's Chardonnay, right?
Oh, yeah, you were. That's right.
How long was that Chardonnay in the stainless steel?
That Chardonnay was we purchased that fruit from Long Island, actually last year, because of that cold, we could not source any Chardonnay in the Finger Lakes. So Kit and I went to Long Island and picked up a 330-gallon tote full of Chardonnay juice, brought it back, fermented it. We fermented that probably over a 10 to 12-day period. And then once it's fermented, we just let the yeast settle, and we rack it a couple of times, which means we basically transfer the clearer portion of the wine at the top to a clean tank and get rid of some of the sediment in the bottom. And then we just let that wine rest in the tank until probably February. Kit started the filtration process. So we do a step-down filtration. So we filter through a couple different size filters. We start out at the larger filter and then go down finer and finer. And then at bottling, we do our sterile filtration and put it in the bottle and put it back in the box and wait for a few months before we release it.
I love it. And that was so much fun. I can't wait to see the release of that 2022 Chardonnay at Bet the Farm Winery. It's really good, everybody. I tasted some. I had to. Like, how could I help bottle and not taste it? Lots of hints of green apple. It was very, very tasty, but different from a lot of Chardonnays that are barrel aged. So there's no like buttery sort of flavors that you get in a lot of Chardonnays.
There's no oak, and we also did not put that wine through malolactic fermentation, which is very common to do in Chardonnay. And the malolactic fermentation, so I just learned this relatively recently, but if you do malolactic fermentation sequentially, that is, you do your primary fermentation of the sugar first and then do your malolactic fermentation, you can get production of a compound called diacetyl. Diacetyl is a compound that gives butter flavor to whatever it's in.
Oh, so that's
it's
where
actually
the butter
what
flavor
they flavor butter popcorn. You know, butter flavored popcorn is flavored with diacetyl.
Okay, that makes so much sense. The one thing that I want to step back on is, what is malolactic fermentation? Did I say that right?
You did. That's really good. So there's basically there's more things in wine than 3 acids, but we'll just talk about the 3 acids. There's malic acid, lactic acid, and tartaric acid. And the malic acid is very similar to the acid that you would find in apples, so it's very tart. Lactic acid is more similar to the acid you would find in milk, so it's very soft acid. So there are cultures of certain enococcal bacteria that you can add to the wine that will help to convert that malic acid to lactic acid. So that's what we do.
Oh, wow. That's very scientific, but I guess that's all wine. Science and
there-
art.
There's a little
and
science.
farming.
I call it yeast farming too. I mean, I feel like in the winemaking process, one of my thoughts is to make sure the yeast have the nutrients that they need to get the sugars fermented. So one of the measurements that we can make on juice or must, which is crushed red grapes, we can measure what's called YAN, or yeast assimilable nitrogen. That's a very hard word to say.
It does. I'm not going to try.
Don't try. But anyway, we'll call it YAN because it's so much easier. The YAN, it tells you how much more nitrogen you need to add during the fermentation process to support the culture of yeast. Now, a lot of winemakers are moving over to natural wild fermentation, so they don't inoculate with yeast cultures. And I don't know, I can't speak to this because I don't know how they do it, but I just wonder if they also measure YAN to know whether or not there's enough nitrogen there to support the full fermentation of the wine.
Sounds like you got some more experimenting to do.
I have some more research to do. Yeah.
Always learning and always growing. That's what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, let's switch gears a little bit and go back to something that you were talking about before with local restaurants and maybe starting something there. And I'm curious about the relationship between the Finger Lakes wineries and local restaurants. Like, is there any relationship there? And if so, what's it like?
I would say there's some. There is a relationship, and I would say that some. Well, let me back it up. We're a small winery, so we are what we call self-distributed. So we don't sell our wine. We don't sell cases of wine to a company like Southern or O-Pee-Chee, or those are big distributing houses. So they buy a lot of wine and a lot of different wines. So they have a big portfolio. When they go out to a restaurant, they have a huge portfolio that the restaurant can choose wines from. We have a very small portfolio. We have maybe 8 to 10 wines at any given time. So we have a relationship with a few restaurants around us. Gola in Ithaca is one of them that's been a great supporter of our wine. Hazelnut Kitchen in Trumansburg. The Glenwood Pines is another one. Garrett's Brewing Company is another one that carries our wines pretty regularly. So we have very limited relationship because we have very limited production. So in general, however, if you go into a lot of restaurants here in the Finger Lakes, I have heard from people that visit here that they're surprised that there aren't more Finger Lakes wines on the wine lists.
So is that something that is a responsibility of the distributors to showcase more? Or is it something that the restaurants aren't necessarily interested in? Like who has the responsibility to stock the restaurants with more local wine? Is it distributor's fault or the restaurant's fault? Or is it the winery's fault?
I can't answer that question.
Oh, interesting.
I don't really know. I mean, Kit and I are grateful for the support we get from a handful of restaurants. It fits our business model because we're not a big producer. So it works for us. Some of the other things, maybe, I mean, if I'm a restaurant owner, I understand a restaurant's position that they're looking to make the most margin they can. And I feel like for restaurants, I don't envy them because I know that food costs in restaurants can just skyrocket. So if they have to make margin on their wines and they can do it in another way, I get it. I totally understand why they would want to do that. But as a tourist area, I can also understand why consumers would go into a restaurant and be a little bit disappointed to see maybe a couple of Finger Lakes wines on the wine list. So,
well, fingers crossed that there's more Finger Lakes wines showing up
Yes.
on menus around the Finger Lakes.
we'll keep our fingers crossed. Yeah.
So, Bet the Farm is one of the closest wineries to downtown Ithaca. I had to look it up, and it seems like you guys are the closest. Tell us what it's like being so close. Do you get a lot of traffic from the college, or what is it like?
Well, it's great.
Yeah.
We get some traffic from the college, typically in May when all the students are graduating either from Cornell or from Ithaca College. We get a fair amount of traffic. We get lots of families that are here celebrating graduations or just picking their children up from school for the semester or dropping them off. We get lots of Cornell families or Ithaca College families visiting. So that's great. The location has really worked out well for us, for sure.
I'm happy to hear it. Nancy, I got one more question for you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I want to close this out by asking you, what is the best thing about Finger Lakes wine?
That's a hard question.
That's why I saved it for last.
Oh my gosh, the best thing about Finger Lakes wine. Well, I think it's the experience. You can visit wineries here and taste the wines and visit with the winemakers. I think that Finger Lakes has a lot going on for consumers to come and sort of immerse themselves in the wine world. I would say that's the best. I mean, the wines are great, but a lot of wines are great, let's face it. But I think the opportunities for people to come and really experience either vineyard tours or winery tours, or they just had FL Excursion up in Geneva. There's just lots of opportunities, and I think that's really great.
And everybody's so nice and shares so much of their time when you visit these wineries for tastings. I mean,
Yeah.
We've been to Bet the Farm several times, me and my wife, and you and Kit just talk with as many people as possible. And it's really cool to talk with the owners and the folks who are out in the field and have, the most experience with these wines rather than just somebody, off the street who doesn't really care and is just there for a paycheck, right? Which you get a lot in California. So
I don't know. I haven't been to California.
I've been to California, and Finger Lakes is way better in terms of experience.
That's good to hear. I think the experience is great. I think the wines are great too. So
me too. And thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing the story about Bet the Farm today and telling us all about Finger Lakes wine. Where can people find out more about Bet the Farm Winery?
Well, they could try our website, btfwines.com. We went away from Bet the Farm because it's too hard to spell.
Is it?
Well, people confused it. They just didn't get it. So we go by BTF Wines now.
Whatever works. I'm happy with that. That's easy enough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for watching and listening today, everybody. Remember, you can learn more about us here at Well Said Media if you need any video services at wellsaidmedia.com. Thanks again, Nancy.
Okay, thank you.